Thank you to all of you for joining me to this fourth lecture. As you can see from the topic of my paper, I will try to develop a longue durée perspective on empire and borderlands within my fourth talk. And I'm going to structure this talk in 3 steps. First one will be an introduction. The second one is the main chapter, of course, the Middle East, Empire and Borderlands, the emergence of a new political structure in the first millennium BCE and its impact in a longue durée perspective. And then some short final words on continuity and discontinuity in dialogue in this context. So let's start with the introduction. In the introduction, I will just deliver some key terms, some general thoughts which are, in my view, of importance to understand what I'm going to deal with. So, as you can see here, in my opinion, there are only 3 regions in the world where, independently from each other, imperial structures emerge for the first time. And when I say emerge for the first time, I mean they do not disappear anymore. So they have been somehow initiated, they are there, and they are there for the until our very present day. So it is the Middle East where we can observe this for the very first time. Of course, we can discuss again whether there are predecessors. There are some, but with its introduction, the beginning of the first millennium BCE in the Middle East, the empire is there and does not leave anymore. A little bit later, it's China at the end of the 3rd century BCE, and of course, we should not forget the Americas, where this takes place in the first millennium CE. My talk, of course, will mainly focus on the Middle East, although the other topics are also of utmost interest. Especially, I will at least a little bit highlight the developments in China, because the developments at the borderlands of China and those at the Middle East, they start to intermingle at a certain period of time. Of course, we will also have to use some key terms, and I have to explain how I'm going to use these key terms. You can already see 3 of them behind me. So the first one is what I would call the imperial arena. That's the area wherein imperial agents are active and where the claim of imperial rule unfolds and becomes manifest. So I think this is very important, and this area does not have to be necessarily identical with an area of direct and indirect rule, rather complementary with imperial reach. Then, of course, you have the imperial agents, and in my view, these imperial agents are mainly the members of the imperial elite who share and convey the imperial idea. There is no empire without an imperial idea. That's, so to say, the ideological basis of any empire in world history. And this imperial idea has a long history. It comes into being with the first empires, and then we can see that as a kind of dialogue it develops, but also continues. Some general characteristics are shared by this all over the empires: the claim to rule the world, the divine mission, the liability, at least on a theoretical basis, as a claim for the flourishing of land and people, are main elements of this kind. There are further terms, of course, and the 2 extremes, so core area versus borderland, is also an important terminological framework for my approach. I'm introducing 3 terms: core area, periphery, and borderlands. Of course, there are areas in between with fluent transitions, that is absolutely clear, but we have to approach this topic also on an abstract level. So as a core area, I understand the center of the empire, which its major residences. At least in the periods I'm talking about, we do not have a capital, we have residences in the pluralis. So these are those sites where the court and the king stay for a certain time in the year. Then we have the term periphery, of course, which is also of importance, that these are the regions within the empire, but at its outer rim. So it includes border provinces, but also vassal states that are subject to regular tributes. And then my key term, so to say, as you can see from the title of my talk, that's the borderlands. What do I understand when I'm talking about borderlands? These are, in my opinion, regions beyond the empire's direct reach, partly within the reach of the empire's campaigning. Irregular payment of tribute and gifts are, let's say, extracted from time to time from these regions, and there is a close interconnection with empire on many levels. And if we want to phrase, let's say, this kind of relationship, I would avoid the term influence. It's actually not influence what we have. It's much more impact, as I will try to show to you immediately, triggering developments in different directions. So we move immediately to the general characteristics of this interaction between core area and borderlands. Of course, there is intensive action and response between empire and borderlands all the time. We face permanent imperial intervention that can be direct or indirect, also in the form of extending the empire's borders. We have imperial impact on the borderlands that triggers, I think that's the most important element, that triggers dynamic social, economic and political reactions. Concerning these reactions, there is always a tension between emulation and rejection in the borderlands. But of course this only takes place because the empire is there, because the imperial impact is there. And what we can also observe is in this kind of interaction zone, the development of novel identities in the borderlands. So you may say borderlands are a privileged area of ethnogenesis. So let's now, after we have somehow clarified my key terms, which I will use during my talk, let us move directly into the main chapter, the Middle East, Empire and Borderlands, the emergence of a new political structure in the first millennium BC and its impact in a longue durée perspective. So that's actually the area which, at least at the very beginning or the first 2/3 of my talk, is central. Here the geographical area of the Middle East, of course, which with its core area, the alluvial plain of nowadays Iraq, the Euphrates and the Tigris, and its borderlands in a geographical sense. In my view, if we have these 2,000 years in mind, which I'm going to move through swiftly together with you, I think we can recognize 4 stages of development. A first stage, which takes place for about 600 years, so with the emergence of the Near Eastern Empire and the death of Alexander the Great, shows a series of imperial structures, so not one, but in total 4, that show a permanent expansion over the centuries. And the heyday, of course, of this development, as you will see immediately, will be the Achaemenid Persian Empire. In stage 2, which takes place quite rather short, so from the death of Alexander the Great to the first half of the 2nd century, it's not exactly possible to catch this with one single year. What we face here is an halt of expansion and a collapse of the unifying empire. We face a struggle for legitimate succession within the already established imperial arena, but the survival and cultivation of the imperial idea. So the imperial idea is still there, although the system as such comes to an halt. Stage 3 is again a very, very long period. So it starts about the middle of the 2nd century BCE, so when the 2 major competitors, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, are not anymore able to uphold imperial status. And we see that again at the very borderlands of this former imperial arena, two new political powers emerge. One in the west, of course, the Roman Empire, at that time the Res Publica Romana, and at the east the Arsacids, and then followed by the Sasanians. This stage 3 is characterized by the fact that both of these powers move into the former imperial arena until they meet in the 1st century BC at the Euphrates. And although they have again and again intentions to overcome the other ones, they are not able to do so, and they have to accept the existence of each other. We face this kind of two competing empires opposite to each other until the 7th century CE, when again a new stage starts. This is my stage number 4, and of course again the development is triggered from the borderlands. This time it's the southern borderlands, of course, the Arabian Peninsula, where a novel imperial formation comes into being, the Arabs, that conquer huge parts of the former imperial arena. So one part, the eastern empire of the former imperial arena, the Sasanians, collapses, and the western one considerably transforms. So you see these 4 steps, all these 4 steps show a very highly dynamic relationship between imperial arena and borderlands. So let's have a look at these developments in much more detail. And I just start again with outlining some general characteristics in the development of this larger scenario which I want to show to you. So stage 1 and stage 2, so this is from the beginning of the Near Eastern Empire until the middle of the 2nd century BC, so shows some similarities. So that's the borderlands take over the empire as a whole at regular intervals. I will show this to you immediately in more detail. We face a fact that the empire extends permanently and its control towards the borderlands. Of course, the borderlands also develop further borderlands, so to say, borderlands of secondary order. And we can see in the longue durée perspective that the core area smoothly shifts out of Mesopotamia. In stage 3 and 4, so that's the time of the Roman Empire and the Arsacids and the Sasanians, and stage 4 is the time when the new Arab world order of Islam, so to say, is introduced. We see that the borderlands are not able anymore to take over the old empire as a whole, and we can mainly see 2 competing empires that are competing for control over the old imperial arena. The core areas, if you have a look at the core areas in stage 1 and 2, it's mainly Mesopotamia and its adjacent eastern and western neighbors. And the borderlands show a wide perspective, a wide range from the Iranian plateau, Central Asia, to the Balkans, the steppe, Northern Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Indian Ocean. And that develops, of course, in step 3 and 4. In step 3, you see that the core areas are now shifting partly out of the old imperial arena into the Mediterranean, but Iran and Mesopotamia still remain central areas, and the borderlands also expand, especially in Eastern Africa and in the Eurasian steppe. And that's also true, or let's say we can see similar changes in step 4, so that's the time of the Arabian expansion, again to remind you, where the core areas are on the one hand returning to those areas which we have already faced in stage 1 and 2, that's especially Mesopotamia, but then again the Mediterranean, the steppe plays an important role, and borderlands again slightly developing, especially the Sahel area, Eastern Africa and the Indian Ocean, become important. So let's have a closer look at the different historical epochs, so that what I have tried to show to you on a quite theoretical level becomes, hopefully, more vivid substance. So have a look, let's start at stage 1. So this is this very first stage, the emergence of empire, accompanied by a continuous expansion beyond and the sequence of imperial formations. So actually we face in this very period 4 huge empires. So the first one, you can see them here lined up. The first is the Near Assyrian Empire, that developed since the 9th century BC with a long history of about 300 years with its residences in Assyria and Upper Mesopotamia, followed by the Neo-Babylonian Empire, as you can see, with a much shorter time of existence, with also centering in Mesopotamia, but the southern part of Mesopotamia, which is Babylonia. And then comes, of course, the Persian Empire of the Thespids and Achaemenids, about 200 years, where the core area slowly shifts into western Iran, but lower Mesopotamia, especially Babylon, still has a certain importance. And of course, finally, and I take the empire of Alexander III as part of this development, we have the very short Macedonian Empire of Alexander III, whose residence is actually mainly the king being on campaign, and if we take his last plan seriously, then Babylon and Babylonia might have become the center of this empire. If we look in this long period of about 600 years, we can see general developments that characterize all these four states, 4 imperial structures, and as you will see, that also have a much longer history. So this is multi-ethnicity and multilingualism that characterize these empires. So they are not national states. They are quite different from national states. We can observe a kind of sacred kingship. We see that the imperial core areas are located in Mesopotamia and western Iran, so quite close to each other. All of them claim to rule the world, of course the world as a, let's say, ideological construction. All of them have open borders, so although this is very different from national states, so the territory is not fixed, there's an open border to the outside, and that actually characterizes what we call the borderlands. We have higher or upper elites that are acting all over the empire. We have local elites as important interactors between center and periphery. We have this idea, at least again on a theoretical level, of welfare and charity. So that's taken from the Roman Empire, what we would call the Pax Assyriaca, Pax Achaemenidica, and so on. And we have this important process of regeneration and revival via the borderlands. I will demonstrate this to you shortly. So here you have the Neo-Assyrian Empire at its maximum extent, let's say in the 7th century, where also Egypt becomes a part of the empire. And we can especially observe that it's at its northern, eastern, and southern borderlands. New and powerful political entities come into being that are for a certain time, let's say, within the reach of the empire. But the relationship of the empire with these borderlands creates new political entities, new forms of political consciousness. This is not only true for the state of Urartu, but it's also very important and very true for the Western Iranian highlands, where new political entities come into being, what the Assyrian calls the Medes, the strong Medes, the distant Medes. But it is also, of course, true for Babylonia, where the Assyrians have a very complicated history with Babylonia, trying to control it in different ways, but at the end not very successfully. And it is no surprise that it is especially these last 2 borderlands the Western Iranian Medes and the Babylonian, who together, or which together, in a very long struggle, in a very long war, overcome the empire. So the empire is overcome with military action from the borderlands that create a new empire. And this new empire is, of course, the Neo-Babylonian one, much shorter. The maximum extent of this empire you can see here. It actually controls nearly the area that was controlled by the Near Eastern Empire, but a little bit less, we have to say it, because Egypt becomes independent. And there is especially a military investment also in Cilicia and on the Arabian Peninsula. But again, it's the borderlands that matters. And it is especially one borderland that becomes extremely important in this context. This is the age-old land of Elam and Anshan. Anshan especially nearly identical with the modern province of Fars, where we can only, the problem is, let me say it that way, is that in many ways we see only the final results of these developments in the borderland. And the final results we can observe here is that from the early 6th century BC onwards, a new power emerges in these borderlands, especially connected with the person of Cyrus, that at the end moves into Western Iran, overcomes the Mede, and finally in 539 overcomes the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and in next stages of a conquest then moves further on. But again, the Neo-Babylonian Empire falls from the borderland, from where a new empire is created that somehow also takes over ideology and structure from the former empire. And this new empire, of course, is the one my 4 talks are mainly dealing with. This is the Persian Empire of the Tayspids and the Achaemenids, again with its maximum extent. So the Assyrians have been expanding their empire. The Persians are continuing this policy, and the empire reaches its maximum extent during this time, from India to the Eastern Mediterranean. And of course, this major expansion results in major impact in the borderlands, because the borderlands are just larger. And actually, from a modern perspective, we would say it even covers 3 continents: Asia, Africa, and Europe. But again, this huge empire is threatened and at the end overcome from the borderlands. So I am referring to the campaign of Alexander III, who inherited a borderland kingdom from his father Philip. And actually he did nearly the same what Cyrus did. Cyrus did it from an eastern borderland, conquering the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and Alexander did it from a western borderland, conquering the former Persian Empire. We only tend to ignore these similarities due to our Eurocentric, Hellenocentric perspective. But actually, on a structural level, it's quite similar. So it took Alexander quite a long time to overcome this huge empire. There was heavy resistance, not only in the great battles, many of you know, but also in the east, in Sogdia especially, there was still heavy fighting. So it took him quite a long time. And Alexander didn't have to prove whether he would have been able to keep this huge empire together, because he died early. And with the death of Alexander, we immediately enter into stage 2 of this imperial history, which is a much shorter period, as you can see again, from the death of Alexander to the first half of the second century. We can see in this very stage that the imperial arena has, so to say, been defined, but what has not been defined is who is going to reign within this imperial arena. So there is an ongoing struggle between the so-called successors, so to say, the heirs of Alexander, without expansion to the outside. This internal struggle we can roughly divide into two phases. A first phase is mainly characterized by as a important figure in this struggle for kingship is Antigonos Monophthalmos and his son Demetrius Poliorcetes, both beaten at the Battle of Ipsos in 301. And then in a second period within this stage, you have mainly two competing superpowers within this older imperial arena. That is the Seleucids, of course, on the one hand, with their center in Babylonia and in Syria, and the Ptolemies, on the other hand, with their center mainly in Egypt, but the whole Eastern Levant plays a larger role. And their, so to say, their imperial status continues until the turn of the 3rd to the 2nd century. So for the Ptolemies, it's quite clear, it's the turn from the 3rd to the 2nd century. With the Seleucids, we may debate when they end to be regarded as a real and true imperial power. One date which is generally very much acknowledged in this respect in scholarship is this Battle of Magnesia, when the Romans beat Antiochus III, but with very good arguments. Rolf Strothmann has pleaded for the fact that we still have to attribute imperial status to the later reign of Antiochus IV. So, but that's a discussion of its own. It does not really matter within our context. So here you have this first phase where Antigonos and the imperial arena is, of course, the one that was defined by the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And here you have the different powers who are struggling for supremacy within this imperial arena. First Antigonos, of course, as the main power, but then already the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, which you can see immediately here, where you have the Seleucids. So you see mainly controlling for a certain part of time nearly the whole former empire, but there are also the Ptolemies, not only with a hold in Egypt, but with strongholds in the eastern Mediterranean, southern Anatolia, and especially also in the Aegean. And at the very same time, of course, we can observe that while these two competitors are struggling for the claim of being the one and true successor, we can see that complicated and again very well known developments at the Borderlands take place, where new political entities come into being in Anatolia, but as you will see immediately also in the East. So if we look at some general developments, so we are interested in a structural approach. That's why these general developments and characteristics are important. Of course, we see some new elements that are important. We have this continuous strive for legitimate rule and control within the already established imperial arena. We observe the fact of no expansion beyond the already established imperial arena, either a rather slow reduction of this arena. We see the emergence of competitive empires for the first time, especially this opposition between the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. And we observe also a plurality of competitive political units in the borderland, some of them to become future empires, other existing only a short period of time. And we see the development of a bunch of different residences, mainly outside of the core area of the former empire. But there is also the imperial heritage. This is important. It connects stage 1 and 2, and you will also see it also connects 1, 2, 3, and 4. Because many of the things we have already been observing continue to exist also in this period. We have, of course, again, multi-ethnicity and multilingualism. We have sacred kingship. We have the claim to rule the world. We have the open borders. We have the importance of the elites, the higher ones, and the local ones. We have the idea of welfare. And, of course, again, we have this process of regeneration and revival in the making via the borderlands that is important. And slowly but certainly it is two superpowers to become empires at the western and the eastern borderlands of this former imperial arena that start to develop. This is of course Rome in the west and the Arsacids in the east, and not to forget also the Maurya in India, who have to be regarded as one of these borderland phenomena. So if we have a look at the Maurya, of course, before the Maurya we have this elusive Nanda state, where we actually do not know much, but for the Maurya it is clear that this empire comes into being at the end of the 4th century BC and continues until the beginning of the 2nd century BC. It shows many examples as a borderland phenomena. So the impact of adapting and developing writing system, the impact of royal ideology, the impact of a trans-regional reign, which can be observed, the erection of stelae and of public inscriptions, that is important. Partly this empire expands into the former imperial arena. There is this famous agreement between the Seleucus and Chandragupta, of course. But on the other hand, it mainly expands towards the other direction, so the areas beyond into northern and central India. Seen from a longue durée perspective, the eastern borderlands of this stage 2 become much more important, where we see the emergence of novel political units in this area, and the most important ones are of course these two, the Arsacids or Parthians, that will become an empire also as a process in the 2nd century BC, and of course the Bactrian kingdom, which we do not have to forget. There you can see this development already. Let's say in the 2nd century, the Arsacids developing their state into an empire, and a crucial point when this has been reached is when the Arsacids conquered definitely Babylonia, integrated it into their empire, because you have to be aware that this is the most powerful economic basis of the whole Middle East. So with the conquest of Babylonia, the Parthians, the Arsacids, become a truly empire. And by the way, what you can see at the very same time, the Roman Empire is approaching from the west, and of course both of these empires will finally meet at the river Euphrates. So both are moving into the former imperial arena from the very western and eastern borderland. The Bactrian kingdom might have also the potential to become a future empire, but actually it didn't. Its beginnings are chronological about at the same time as the beginnings of the Arsacid state, let's say at the middle of the 3rd century BC. But then, it already faces some setbacks in the end of the 3rd century BC with the loss of Sogdia, and then it mainly moves towards the south and southeast into India, and it is finally overcome and disappears at the second end of the 2nd century BC, which has something to do with the upcoming of new political entities, especially the so-called Yuezhi and the Saka. So the western borderlands show the same phenomena, of course. Also here we can see that new novel political units emerge, some of them with high potential, but which does not really develop. Others become the future empire, and it's mainly two. One is the Res Publica Romana, of course, Rome as empire in the making in the 4th and 3rd century, and of course also Carthage, which has to be mentioned in this context. So both of these Western states are, of course, highly, let's say, engaged by their wars against each other. So the wars of Rome against Carthage, the most famous one is, of course, the war of Hannibal, and as all of you know, Rome succeeds in this very confrontation, and then starts immediately to move into the Eastern Mediterranean and towards the core area of the former imperial arena. So with this expansion of Rome and from the western borderlands and the Arsacids from the eastern ones, we enter in stage 3 of my overview. So this is defined by the collapse of the competing successors at the 2nd century BC, Seleucids and Ptolemies, within the former imperial arena, and the emergence of two novel imperial formations, as I have just been describing it. Both have an expansionist agenda and both move into this former imperial arena. And this is in the east, the Arsacid and Sasanian. I prefer to take the Arsacid and Sasanian as one empire that was reigned by two different dynasties, so not as two different empires. So the Arsacid and the Sasanians from the 3rd century BC to the middle of the 7th century. And then, of course, also the Roman Empire, and I've just been describing this development, both superpowers that emerge in the borderlands. So again, we are mainly interested in general characteristics of this borderlands. Of course, from my perspective, the most important one is from east and from west, this vigorous expansion into the former imperial arena from east and west, until both empires meet at the river Euphrates, so in the 1st century BC. Both have the claim to rule the world, and actually both in principle have the idea to overcome the other one, but they are not able to do this successfully over the long period of coexistence. So this does not happen, although the intent would be there. So this results, of course, in the emergence of two competing imperial arenas in West and East. So in German we could describe this as Flügelmächte. I do not know whether there is an appropriate English term to this to describe this phenomenon. So a novel system of two truly competing empires. And in both of them, in the long period of time, we see the increasing dominance of specific religious belief systems. Of course, this is at the end Christianity in the West and Zoroastrism in the East. We see the development, the evolution of new borderlands in the West, especially with the Roman expansion. These new borderlands are Europe, Central Europe, but also Western Europe, Northern Africa, of course, but also in the East, especially with Arabia, the steppe, and Eastern Africa. We have an increasing interaction with political units emerging at the Chinese borderlands. So this is very important, and I can only touch this. We have a similar development in China, where also from the Chinese borderlands, new political units come into being. The first empire of the steppe, as it is many times called, the Xiongnu. But in this period, these borderland phenomena from the West and the East start to intermingle and start to come into contact, so that we have, in Central Asia, of course, a dynamization of the interaction zones between the evolving Eurasian empires, that is Rome, the Arsacids and Sasanians in the West, and of course China in the East. But again, the imperial heritage is there, and I'm not going to read it out again. So all these points you have already encountered, and all these points are present in all the empires I have been so swiftly passing by. And this is a kind of imperial heritage we are facing, and that shows continuity in this very context. So just have a look into details about how the Western Empire, the Roman Empire, from the Western borderlands moves into the East. This is about the very beginning, when Rome starts to reach out into the Eastern Mediterranean. This is about the phase when Pompey, I've been discussing this 2 days ago, establishes his new order, the new provinces in the east, and when the Euphrates becomes a definite borderline between Rome and the Arsacids. Here you have mainly the situation during the time of the High Empire at its largest extension, of course, when Emperor Trajan at the beginning of the 2nd century AD tried to overcome the Parthian Empire with his campaign for a very short time, controlling Mesopotamia and even reaching the Persian Gulf, but this was a very, very short period. These conquests had to be given up immediately after the death of Trajan, and actually the old border was re-established in the region around the Euphrates between the Roman Empire and then it's the Sasanian opponent in the east. So, and let's face the same developments in the east. That's the very early phase when the Arsacid Empire starts to emerge in the 3rd century, as well as the Greco-Bactrian kingdom. We have already seen that this Greco-Bactrian kingdom does not really develop into an imperial structure, but the Arsacids definitely do so. We have already seen this map where the Parthians, Arsacids, move into Mesopotamia and become an imperial superpower that matters. And here again, the Sasanian Empire with its large extent towards the east and the northeast, and again the borders with Rome. So this ongoing conflict between these two major empire. Yes, and that's the final one, probably not probably, but showing, let's say, about the borderlines in the 7th century, when we face a very final last huge war, about 20 years taking place between the Sasanians and the Roman, where it looked like if this time finally one of them, the Sasanians, could have been successful, because the Sasanian conquered major parts of the Eastern Roman imperial arena. Syria, Egypt became a part of the Sasanian Empire. There was a siege which was laid on Constantinople, but at the end also with the counterattack by Emperor Heraclius, this failed. And probably this long war between these superpowers was one of many reasons that made it not so difficult for the new power emerging at the southern borderlands, the Arabs, to overcome both of them. So I have again and again highlighted the importance of the borderland and demonstrating the empires as agents of economic and social dynamics that stimulate local and individual agencies in the borderlands and political developments. And I want to adduce at least one example to you, and I am just referring to a very recent publication of my dear friend Rahim Shayegan, who has demonstrated this so perfect. So I'm going to have a look with you at the borderlands, at the eastern borderlands of the Sasanians that they share with the Kushan Empire, to which I will come then in a second. So we are in the 3rd century CE, dealing with the Sasanian borderlands in the very east. And it was the time of the Shah Bahram II, when the Sasanian Shah was challenged by probably a relative in this Kushano-Sasanian borderlands, a man named Achaemenid I, who challenged the Shah also in the way that he claimed royal titles that clearly showed that he had aspirations in overtaking the empire. But this claim took place in a very specific borderland, and that's important, a borderland that had a specific audience that had to address to. And it was a borderland at the fringes between the Iranian world and the Indian world. And on his coins, this Achaemenid not only presented himself, but he also showed an Indian motif, the so-called Nandi bull, who was especially a companion of the god Shiva, but in that very case, the Shiva was transferred into an Iranian language, the god Vesh, Bactrian god Vesh, which is presented. So challenging the empire from the borderlands in addressing a specific audience at this very borderlands, using a language of power, an iconography of power that has specifically been made for this very audience. Wahram II successfully overcame these very challenge, and this is also shown by some documents, and one of them you can see in the wonderful exhibition at the Getty at the moment. So this is this medallion, which has been perfectly explained by Rahim, putting it into this very context, where now Shah Wahram II presented himself as the one who is controlling the Nandi bull, and obviously he's taken over a position that was formerly taken over by a god. And again, it's interesting, who are the addressees of this message? That can only be the elites of these very borderlands, to whom the king not only showed that he has been successful, but where he had chosen a language of power, a pictorial language of power that was understood by these borderlands elites. And there was not only, at the very same time, there was not only, let's say, a challenge from the east, but at the same time a challenge from the west, because the Roman Emperor Carus launched a campaign against the empire, and I think also, as Rahim has explained very convincingly, one of the famous reliefs in Naqsh Rustam just shows the double victory of the Shah against Carus, the Roman emperor in the north, and the one emerging from the borderlands in the lower part. And this kind of, let's say, imperial celebration of victory could also be put in a language that is more, let's say, more playing with specific symbols and specific meanings. And this is shown by the relief of Sare Mashha, which you can see here, where the king, the Shah again, is killing at first hand 2 lions, but with a high degree of possibility. Also these lions represent the opponents so successfully overcome by the Sasanian Shah. Of course, it is not only these Kushano-Sasanian borderlands that start to gain importance, but it's generally the eastern borderlands and Central Asia, where we can see that in these borderlands new political entities come into being, starting with the 1st century BCE. And I want to remind you again that there we face a dynamic where the very eastern borderlands of China and those of the former imperial arena of stage 1 and 2 start to intermingle. I am referring to the already mentioned state and empire of the Kushana, whose beginnings start or can be traced back to the 1st century, but then especially in late antiquity, it's these 3 political entities, the Kidarites, the Hephthalites, and the Alchon, which we face at the borderlands of the Sasanian Empire. There, of course, you see the Kushana here at the eastern borderlands, again with the tendency to move into the east, into India. But also these 4 short-term empires, 4 short-term states I have been hinting at, the Kidarites, which you can see here, the Alchon, which you can see here, and probably the most important one, the Hephthalites, who gained importance for at least 50 years. But all of them can be very well described and understood as borderland phenomena. And of course, this is also true for the northern borderlands of the Sasanian and Roman Empire, where again new political units start to emerge from the 4th to the 6th century BC, starting with the Sarmatians, the Alans, the Huns, the Avars, and the Bulgarians. And I'm just going to show to you some of them. All of them show these very specific characteristics of borderland phenomena. So here you have the short-term empire, as I may call it, of the Huns, that starts to begin in the Hungarian plain at the borderlands of the Roman Empire around 400 CE, and of course especially developing a very dynamic power raiding into the Roman Empire and having for a short period of time an important moment. Then there is the state of the Avars that has, it's not yet absolutely clear, but that has for sure connections to the so-called, or to a political entity which we face in Chinese sources as Ruran, but then establish a state again at the middle of the 6th century BC, again in the Roman borderlands, who establish a Khaganate, also very short period of time existing, but very, very powerful and perfectly explained as a borderland phenomenon. And actually the same is true for the Bulgarians, who have been originally a part of the Avar Confederation, who are emerging at this Avar Roman borderlands in the 7th century. The connection to the Roman Empire, to the core area, so to say, is clearly expressed by the fact that its early ruler Kubrat has been baptized in Constantinople, so also the new forms of beliefs become to extend towards the borderlands and become political power, political dimension. But also here a very short-term phenomenon with Kubrat's death. It collapses and it moves into another borderland empire, which I'm not going to discuss here anymore, the empire of the Khazars, who are emerging from the east, as you can see here on these maps. The western borderlands of the Roman Empire are also of utmost importance, where we see, and this is probably the arena that is best studied in modern scholarship, where we observe that at least from the beginnings already started in the 1st century CE, but they become much more dynamics in the 3rd and 4th century BC, where a whole bunch of Germanic tribes and regna emerge in these borderlands of the Roman empires, of course, especially gaining power and dynamics in this period of transformation in the 4th, 5th, and 6th century BC. And many of them are not empires, but they are just states that emerge as borderland phenomena. This is, of course, true for the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, the Vandals, the Burgundians, the Alemanni, and then the Franks, as I will show you to you at least shortly. So the Alemanni that come into being starts to emerge in the sources around in the 3rd century CE, with a place in southwestern Germany. But most important are, of course, the Franks, again in the borderlands of the Roman Empire, and then who start to move into the Roman Empire. And at the end, it's only the Franks who gain imperial power after a long period of development with the empire of Charlemagne. But it's not only the east, the north, and the west, but it's also the south, where we see that borderland structurally matters, and where new political entities come into being at the borderlands of the Roman and the Sasanian Empire. And I'm especially referring to the Arabs and to what the kingdom of Aksum, which in nowadays Ethiopia, and southern Arabia. It is in this time that we have actually the earliest attestation of the term Arab as self-designation in a Safavid inscription from nowadays Jordan, probably to be dated into late antiquity. So you see also this element that borderlands trigger processes of ethnogenesis and asking the question, who am I, who are we? We have to define ourselves in opposite to the imperial arena. The dynamics that can be described in these southern borderlands emerge mainly due to the fact that the Roman Empire and the Sasanian Empire are really competitors in gaining controls of the Indian trade, and we can see that both of them have, so to say, local allies, local borderlands that they foster, develop, and trigger. This is a phenomenon we can observe from north to south. It touches the tribes of the Arabs, where the kingdom of the Lachmids at the borderlands of the Sasanian Empire are the allies of the Sasanians, and the Razanids allies of the Roman Empire. But it is also true for two political formations at the southern mouth of the Red Sea, this emerging kingdom of Aksum that is an important ally of the Roman Empire, and on the other side is especially this kingdom of Himyar, nowadays Yemen, which is allied to the Sasanian Empire, and both come into being within this larger framework, and both can very well be described as borderland phenomena. And it's exactly that time when a new political power starts to develop and emerge on the Arabian Peninsula. We are still not yet completely able to understand what's going on, because what we see is the result of a unification process that takes place in these times, especially of the 6th and then 7th century BC, and fostered by a new religious belief, a monotheistic belief, and its result, all of you know, this is the unification of the Arabian Peninsula by Muhammad, and then the powerful conquest that emerges out of this field. And we are already moving into stage 4, where we see the emergence of a novel imperial formation at the southern borderlands. And the results of this emergence, I think all of you know, this is the collapse of the Eastern Empire. The Sasanian Empire completely disappears, is conquered totally by this new borderland political unity. And the Western Empire is transformed into what we moderns would call the Byzantine Empire, but it remains a Roman Empire, of course, a Greek-speaking Roman Empire, but with much less political power. What we see then is especially the first two phenomena popping up, of course, the establishment of new imperial structures from this new power of the south, with two dynasties, the Umayyad and the Abbasid Empire mainly, and the Eastern Roman Basileia, the Byzantine Empire, has still imperial claims, but is on a much smaller content. And the Umayyad Caliphate in Cordoba and the Fatimid Caliphate in North Africa, as well as the emerging empire of Charlemagne, already moves into later periods and shows to you that political processes become more and more complex, and that already established imperial arenas are breaking up again. And there is a further point that has to be mentioned. I can only touch it shortly. We have already seen in stage 3 that the Chinese borderlands and the borderlands of the Middle Eastern former imperial arena start to intermingle. This gains momentum in stage 4, where, as I would call it, empires in between, in between the Western imperial arena and between the Chinese imperial arena, start to enter the scene. This is especially true with the first and second Turkic Khaganate of the 6th and 7th century, and the Uyghur Khaganate, its successor, in the 8th and 9th century. Of course, we are mainly interested into general developments, and that's what we have to look for. So what is new in this epoch? Of course, we can see different developments in different regions, and to a certain amount this cannot be denied, an increase of complexity. So this is true for Europe, Central Asia, and the Eastern areas as well. The most important element, and I have already been highlighting it, is this vigorous expansion from the south into the imperial arena. Of course, this is the Arab expansion, what I have been mentioning. And we have seen this only taking over successfully as a whole the imperial arena of the former Eastern Empire, that is the Sasanian, whereas the Arabs were not able to entirely conquer and outbeat the Roman Empire. But it is interesting that With the establishment of these new empires, of these new Arab empires, especially the Umayyads and the Abbasids, we see a kind of re-establishment of the imperial arena of stage 1 and 2, especially in the sense that Syria and Mesopotamia become again core areas of these new empires, which is then especially true with the foundation of Baghdad in Abbasid times. We can see that if you have a look at this Umayyad and then Abbasid empire, we can see that we face only a minimal expansion beyond the areas controlled by the former empires. It's especially, if we have a general look at this, especially the region of Transoxiania in the east, which the Arabs call Mawara and Nachar, that brings them, by the way, into direct contact with the Chinese, and the famous Battle of Talas in 751 testifies to this event. At the very same time, we see a development towards disentanglement and fragmentation. This is also of high interest within the novel established imperial arena, which is clearly shown by, at the end of this development, by a plurality of caliphates. So we have an Abbasid caliphate, we have a Fatimid caliphate, we have a former Umayyad caliphate in Cordoba, and we of course have a plurality of empires, especially the old Roman Empire with Constantinople, and then the empire of Charlemagne in the west. So this kind of competition also reminds us somehow of what we have been observing already in stage 2. So there you see again this Arab expansion into different steps, and it's only the very east where new areas are controlled. On a global scale, and that's what we have reached now, we see that competing imperial claims come into being that somehow, let's say, developing in a huge battle, but the result is also clear. We have a kind of imperial polyphony, as I would call it. We have the Caliphate versus the Roman Basileia versus the Carolingian Empire. We have the Caliphate versus China. We have the Abbasid Caliphate versus the Umayyad Caliphate and the Fatimid Caliphate. So this plurality is of high interest and is part of this process of complexity. We have at the same time a stabilization process of the idea of an intrinsic connection between imperial idea and a very specific religious belief. So empires foster them with a very specific notion of belief system. We can see that in this polyphony of Germanic regna, only one of these regna finally becomes a real empire. That's the one of Charlemagne, so at the turn from the 8th to the 9th century. And I would also like to mention this, we have a kind of evolution at the very same time, as I would call it, a meta-empire within the former Western arena, that is the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, who is actually controlling a small area directly, but his ideological and power is of course very much transregional. So you here see the Carolingian Empire at its maximum extent developing in the northeast. We have of course a huge expansion again of borderlands that has to be mentioned, especially in the west, England, in the north, Scandinavia, in Eastern Europe of course, but again in Africa, including the Sahel zone. We have, again, a much more dynamic system of interaction zones between the different Eurasic empires, and this is also true for the western steppe and the eastern steppe, where new political entity in these new developing borderlands come into being. And this is, I think, also of high interest. We have the establishment of novel imperial conceptions and titles, novel ones, which are only partly rooted in former imperial traditions. This is especially, the first example we have is with the Huran or with the Avars, where this title of Kagan comes into being with an imperial claim, that's absolutely clear, and the Turks, the Uyghurs, the Avars, the Bulgars, the Khazars, and so on, they all inherit this new terminology. Of course, the same is true with the new superpower from the south, the Arabs, which also introduce a new imperial title, the title of Caliph, in the 7th century. But at the very same time, simultaneously, we have a continuation of the traditional concepts of empire within the former core zones, so the title of emperor, Caesar, and its derivation, German Kaiser, Russian Tsar, and of course Shah, has to be mentioned in this context. And again, the imperial heritage, the elements I have been mentioning again and again, is still there. So after 2,000 years, it is still there. So let me finally come to an end. As you have been seen, as you have seen with my very last examples, this opposition of continuity and discontinuity is something that I think paradigmatically shows this dynamics between empire and borderlands, between history and so to say Gegenwart. And this can be shown with a bunch of examples and just picking out some as a kind of conclusion. When we observe the emergence of the new empire of the south, the new empire of the Arabs, of course, they were seeking for expressing themselves in a language of power that was adaptive to the already existing political systems. And if you have a look at these early coins of the Arab expansion, it's of the first caliph of the Umayyads, Muawiyah, you would say this is a perfect Sasanian coin, and actually it is. It's just a copy of a Sasanian coin which was reintroduced into the new imperial form. And the early coinage of the Arabs is not only orientating itself towards the Sasanians, but also picking up elements of the Roman Empire. So the two existing imperial predecessors, where you can see here the emperor with the globe, but again included Arabic inscriptions. So this combination coming out of an imperial tradition and adapting it. And it takes some time actually until the Caliph Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan, the beginning of the 8th century, when truly a real, so novel Arabic coinage has been developed. The same can be shown on many other ways. So this wonderful coin also shown in the Getty exhibition, a dinar of Khosrow II, shows at the back the bust of a deity within the flame nimbus. Of course, you can connect this with the Hwarna, or even older, also with the Babylonian concept of Melamu. But if you see, how the prophet has been depicted in later periods, you can observe an ongoing element of this kind of the pictorial representation of very specific persons or deities. Another example you can see in the Getty is this very famous cup from Georgia, where you see the Shah Bahram II raising his right hand and finger in a very specific gesture of greeting in an ancient Near Eastern tradition, as this famous stele of Ehsan shows, where the same gesture of fingers is very well attested as an ancient Near Eastern heritage. And a final example also leading us to the wonderful exhibition at the Getty. We see here this coin, and it takes us back to Achaemenid times of the 4th century in Cilicia. Generally, the communis opinio is interpreting this coin as showing an Achaemenid satrap. If we follow, however, a very recent suggestion made by Fabrizio Sinisi, and I think he has very good arguments for this, we do not see here the satrap, but the Achaemenid Persian king, who is controlling arrow and bow in an imperial gesture. And if you see it this way, the famous and characteristic element of Seleucid coinage, where it is the god Apollon on the omphalos who controls the arrow, can suddenly be put into larger imperial framework where clearly the forms are Greek, but the scenario as such has been adapted from the older empire. And of course you can draw a direct line to the Arsacid coinage, where the famous founder of the dynasty, Arsacid, is shown at the back of the coins in a gesture where he is checking his bow. So we see this trans-regional entanglement of empires and borderlands that starts in the first millennium, beginning of the first millennium BC, and ends in a very complex process, but nevertheless a process that can be followed up at the end of the first millennium AD. And of course it continues, but we are running out of time. Thank you for your attention.